Is it an overdue reckoning? It's more than just Jacob Zuma on trial, and it's about more than the bribery scandal involving French arms maker Thales. Opening day in court comes more than 20 years after the case was first opened. We'll ask about the specifics of a deal that led to the conviction of a Zuma former advisor in 2004, long before he became South Africa's president. Any trial of a former head of state is always a test for a nation's institutions. State capture scandals have pushed Zuma into retirement, but he's still got a loyal following that claims it's a political witch hunt. This one comes against the backdrop of an internal power struggle within the same ANC that has ruled South Africa since the end of apartheid. Which way for the nation under President Cyril Ramaphosa? Thales, the French company at the heart of the scandal, also denies. And the trial, it says, focuses on a bygone era. Emmanuel Macron, by the way, touches down Friday for a state visit. The French president, who's been eager to display he's of a new generation when it comes to dealing with the continent. How will he fare once he is on the ground? Today in the France 24 debate, we're looking at South Africa and the Zuma trial. And joining us from Pietermaritzburg, Nabila Sheikh, reporter for ETV, who was covering that opening gavel. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you for having me on the show.
From Durban, he's a former spokesperson for the ANC and for Nelson Mandela. Carl Niehaus, spokesperson for the Umkhonto weSizwe Military Veterans Association. I believe you were there as well today.
Good evening. Yes, I was there. And in fact, I have been there for the last 22 years at every appearance of President Zuma during this long and protracted persecution that takes place against him.
Thank you for joining us. We want to thank as well former ANC Member of Parliament Andrew Feinstein, who joins us from London. You're Executive Director of Corruption Watch UK and the author of After the Party, Corruption, the ANC and South Africa's Uncertain Future. You've been called to testify at the trial.
That's correct. Good evening. Good to be with you.
And also from London, former South African diplomat Darius Jonker, Africa Director at the Eurasia Group. Welcome to the show.
Good evening, Francois. Good to see you again.
The France 24 debate on Facebook and Twitter, hashtag F24debate. It all started with a 1999 contract that included warships, a tip-off about an encrypted fax spelling out bribery installments, the 2005 conviction of a Zuma financial advisor, now the moment of reckoning for the 79-year-old former president on trial for racketeering, money laundering, fraud, and corruption. Yinka Oyatade has more.
How do you plead to them?
I plead not guilty.
Former South African President Jacob Zuma denying charges of corruption, fraud, racketeering and money laundering. The accusations date back more than 2 decades. Prosecutors say Zuma, during his time as deputy president back in 1999, accepted annual payments of tens of thousands of dollars from French arms company Thales. This in exchange for protecting the firm from an investigation into a $2 billion deal. AJ Zuklal worked as a lawyer for Thales 6 years ago. He claims Pierre Moino, former head of the company's local subsidiary, played a key role in the alleged corruption scandal.
I was just an observer at that time when Mr. Moino passed all these monies not only to Mr. Zuma, but he also paid for the services of the former Minister of Justice, Mr. Penuel Maduna, in a London hotel. That amount was 50,000 euros.
Zuklal is one of around 200 witnesses that will be called on by the prosecution to testify at the hearings. The defense argued that the prospects of a fair trial are at stake. They are demanding that State Prosecutor Billy Downer be recused.
There are facts and circumstances that give me a reasonable impression that Mr. Downer has conducted himself in this case in a manner that lacks the independence and impartiality that is necessary for a lawful prosecution.
Numerous supporters gathered outside the court Wednesday. For them, Zuma will always be the people's president, while his critics say his 9-year tenure was replete with fraud and misconduct. If convicted, Zuma faces 25 years in prison.
Nabila Sheikh, how did Jacob Zuma seem in court?
Well, the former president has always protested his innocence, and he did the same today when he addressed hundreds of supporters that came out to show their support for him at the Pietermaritzburg High Court. His demeanor has always been such in that he's stood firmly to say that he would not be subjected to a fair trial, and that was the basis of what we heard in court today with that special plea coming out. Some of the allegations that were being made there were very serious allegations against the state prosecutor, the lead state prosecutor in this matter, Billy Downer, that dates back to many years ago, including allegations of intervention of foreign intelligence agencies, allegations of information being leaked to the media. And it was on that basis that he put forward that special plea saying he wants Billy Downer to be recused from this case so that he can be granted a fair trial.
So if I understand correctly, as a result of these motions filed by the defense, day 2 of the trial won't be till July.
That's correct. So what's now going to happen is this trial will only now resume on the 19th of July, and that is when Judge Pete Koen would actually adjudicate over that special plea. Both parties now have time to file their affidavits with regards to the plea that has been put forward.
Billy Downer, as we saw in that report, the prosecutor who was the same who led the charge to convict back in 2005, a key aide to Jacob Zuma. He is the target of the defense. Why is that?
That's correct. I think one of the main reasons in that special plea was because Zuma believes that there was an agenda behind him actually being criminally charged in this matter, that there's a long-standing political agenda against him. He's mentioned that there was information that were allegations of information that was being leaked to the media to deliberately taint his reputation and land him in jail. He's made allegations with regards to foreign intelligence agencies and the links that they've had with regards to this investigation, all alleging that it goes back to Billy Downer. And taking into consideration all of these factors, that plea and the reason the defense is actually, or Zuma and his team is coming after Downer, is because of those reasons. And that is why they do not want him to be involved in this case any longer.
Carl Niehaus, what are the chances of the judges ruling in the former president's favor?
Well, I can obviously not judge what Mr. Justice Koen will be doing. What I can say is that what we heard today in court, as it was presented by the legal team of President Zuma, were very disturbing but not unknown information about manipulation of these politically motivated charges for the last 22 years. As I've said right at the beginning, I have been attending this trial for the last 22 years. I've been following it in great detail, and I'm fully aware of the manner in which the National Prosecuting Authority, also the then head of the National Prosecuting Authority, Advocate Bulelani Nguka, had been involved in manipulating this trial and even the timing of the arrest of President Zuma in order to do as much damage as possible to his political career. So these are not just some kind of willy-nilly allegations that are being made. These are very serious statements by President Zuma and the defense, backed up by hard evidence, which was provided today. Now,
but if this was the only case, we could take that at face value. But you realize it's difficult to convince a lot of viewers because of the fact that there have been so many other cases against Jacob Zuma.
What other cases have been, except for allegations that have been made at the State Capture Commission, and those allegations in themselves have to be proved if they are to lead to any conviction or President Zuma being found guilty. So one has to be very careful to make this kind of sweeping statement that you've just made about all these allegations that have been brought against President Zuma. In fact, there's a very large proportion of the South African population who do not believe that these allegations will stick, who believe that they are politically motivated. And the ENCA reporter is quite wrong to refer to hundreds of people who were outside the court There were many thousands of people outside the court today, and every time that President Zuma in the last 22 years have been appearing in court, there have been large crowds of people who support him, and I can assure you that they will continue to do so.
Andrew Feinstein, you're been called as a witness for the prosecution. I realize there must be limits on what you can or cannot say, but what can you answer there to what you just heard from Carl Niehaus?
Well, I think the most obvious thing is that we shouldn't forget that Jacob Zuma's financial advisor, Shabir Shaikh, was found guilty of corrupting Jacob Zuma on the basis of money that had been procured from Thales to assist them in relation to the South African arms deal, as it was known. He was sentenced to 15 years in jail for that offense. Now, what is interesting about that is that that decision was appealed. It was also taken to South Africa's leading court, the Constitutional Court, the ultimate court, if you will, in South Africa. And both on appeal and at the Constitutional Court, the verdict was affirmed by those courts. So I think that what has happened is that Mr. Zuma has spent much of the past 20 years trying to prevent this matter coming to court. He has, on the one hand, said to his supporters repeatedly that he is waiting for his day in court because then justice will be done. But he has spent an extraordinary amount of money and gone through innumerable legal processes to try and keep this matter out of court. And I think that, together with the Shaikh verdict that was affirmed twice, really speaks to itself about the prospects both for Mr. Zuma and for Thales in relation to the case that has now started.
Yeah, this case has gone on for more than 2 decades. Andrew Feinstein, Shabir Shaikh, he's convicted in 2005. That's long before Jacob Zuma became president of South Africa. What does that tell you?
Well, I think what we saw then is, there is no doubt that part of what has gone on in relation to the South African arms deal, which was a point at which South Africa decided to spend $10 billion on weaponry that we had virtually no need of, much of which has never been used until today, and in which a conservative estimate suggests about $350 million of bribes were paid. Now, in relation specifically to Thales and Shabir Shaikh, he was found guilty. He was found guilty of corrupting Jacob Zuma on the basis of money that had been acquired by Zuma and Shaikh from Thales, and in return for which President Zuma performed certain services and functions for Thales. I unfortunately can't go into detail on that because that'll serve as part of my evidence. So I think what it does show, and in addition to which, as importantly, is that once Jacob Zuma became president, one of his first acts was actually to get Shabir Shaikh out of prison, utilizing a piece of legislation that is meant to be used in the case of long-term prisoners who have a mortal illness to allow them in their last weeks of life to spend their last weeks and days with their family. Now, Shabir Shaikh suffered from depression and various other things and was in a prison hospital for most of his 1.5 years of incarceration, but they were at no point were they life-threatening. So this legislation was entirely misused to get Mr. Shaikh out of jail. And unfortunately, that sort of behavior by Jacob Zuma, abusing the legal framework, abusing the courts, is exactly what is being investigated currently by a Judicial Commission of Inquiry into State Capture, which was effectively the looting of billions and billions of rands of state funds while Jacob Zuma was president. Now, unlike many others, I don't find myself on either side of this factional divide within the ANC, because I was effectively forced out of parliament by Jacob Zuma's predecessor, President Thabo Mbeki. What I do is I am a global anti-corruption investigative researcher, writer, and filmmaker. And on that basis, I believe both in relation to this arms deal case and in relation to state capture, Jacob Zuma has an overwhelming amount of evidence to answer in court.
Darius Jonker, let me ask you, what is Thales' responsibility in all of this? Is this something extraordinary, or is this unfortunately something you see not just in South Africa, but across the continent?
Well, if you look at the role of multinational arms companies, defense contractors, the kind of payments that facilitate transactions are part and part of the process around the world. And this is something that Andrew Feinstein specializes in investigating and reporting on. And there were other investigations into the arms deal, into other arms contractors and the like. German companies, British companies, Swedish companies. And there is a sense within some corners of the ruling African National Congress that Thales and Zuma are the unfortunate scapegoats when there were many others who were involved and who have escaped the courts and who've eluded the courts. And this is part of the reason why there's this grievance among Zuma supporters that he is being targeted. While many others, some were named now in some of your coverage, like Penwell Maduna, others you hear whispers of. I was a diplomat, for example, and my colleagues who worked in the countries where some of these companies were based would tell me stories of what they saw in the 90s. And so somebody like Jacob Zuma, who's a senior leader in the party, knew about a lot of what was happening. And now he is the one who has to take the fall. And I think in many regards...
Why? Is this because of that? Is this because of that facts, that the original facts where they're talking about what the increments would be on a yearly basis of payment?
This is a key piece of evidence. The facts that hinted at some of the payments that were to be made to Zuma. But there's other evidence as well that is likely to be presented in this trial around meetings in France and the like, meetings facilitated again by the South African ambassador to France at the time. And so Thales, like Zuma, is entitled to their day in court, to the best defense they can procure. And so we will be seeing very technical arguments about why Thales and why Zuma.
And one at some of the others. We're gonna pick up on these points. We have to take a very quick break. Stay with us. You're watching the France 24 debate. Welcome back, or welcome if you're just joining us. It's the France 24 debate. Jacob Zuma, South Africa's former president, pleading not guilty on the first day of his corruption trial involving French arms maker Thales. With us to talk about it, she covered court proceedings for ETV. Nabila Sheikh is in Pietermaritzburg. Also with us from Durban, Carl Niehaus, spokesperson for the Mkoto Wisizwe Military Veterans Association, former spokesperson for the African National Congress, former member of parliament for the ANC. Andrew Feinstein joins us from London, executive director of Corruption Watch UK. And from London, former South African diplomat Darius Jonker, Africa director at the Eurasia Group. We were talking just before the break how there are several probes going on right now around this trial, as well as an internal power struggle. And the ANC's old guard has been in the news. The former Speaker of Parliament, Baleka Mbete, telling a commission investigating state capture that she didn't act on a tip-off about Thales back in 1999 because it was anonymous and because lawmakers' agenda was already overloaded. That has prompted skepticism from Daily Maverick cartoonist Zapiro about that explanation. Here you see each bubble in the cartoon corresponds to a year since. That's part of the issue here. Is this has been this sword of Damocles, Darius Jonker, for more than 2 decades. So, if justice is not swift, how fair can the trial be?
Well, South Africa's institutions are very strong. Our courts are very strong. Our judiciary is very independent. And so, from a technical perspective, this is very likely to be a fair trial. Of course, the argument by the Zuma side is that it cannot be fair, precisely because it has carried on for so long. And, they won't mention the fact that that's been part of their strategy, because that's not something they will acknowledge. But I think at the end of the day, one must see this as contestation for political power. That is really what's at the heart of this matter. Within the ANC, which is a broad grouping, many different people, you can see the diversity of membership of the ANC. If you look at Mr. Niehaus and his background, and you look at Mr. Feinstein and his background, and they're different ideologies, they're different groups. And this case is an example of how one group is feeling aggrieved and is using it for political purposes to try and regain prestige and power, and then to influence party processes accordingly to come to power. So it's two different things. The court case itself is very likely to be sound and technical and fair. But on the other hand, the political fight, which is very much part of it, is as dirty as any political fight around the world will be.
Yeah, we've been watching Nabila Sheikh, how there has been this move to oust the Secretary General of the ANC as part of that internal power struggle within the party that's ruled South Africa since the end of apartheid. Covering this case, which is one case, is it difficult when you have this background music or background noise, depending on how you look at it?
Well, indeed, but I think it also makes the case a lot more interesting, because South African politics never fails to amaze you. The type of reactions that we get from some of these politicians when they attend these cases. Like last week, you had mentioned the suspended ANC Secretary General. He had actually taken the podium at court when the former president made an appearance, where he used the platform as well to speak about his suspension. And we then saw a bit of backlash coming out from some members of the ANC saying that the trial was being used for the wrong reasons. So it is very interesting, but at times it can get difficult to cover it from that perspective as well.
Yeah, and this state capture inquiry that was mentioned by Andrew Feinstein in part one of our discussion, it's also offered up uncomfortable moments for the current president. Last month, Cyril Ramaphosa, appearing before the commission, he had to defend himself against allegations regarding the financing of his winning run in 2017 for ANC president.
Today, we don't know how it has a legend that goes around that the money was used to buy votes, and far from it. And I said to my comrades right at the beginning, I never want to be part of a campaign that is going to descend into all these deviant type of behaviors that we talk about in the ANC about vote buying. And I even said I would rather lose the race rather than have votes bought.
Carl Niehaus, your reaction?
Well, let me first of all deal with what Andrew Feinstein said, because I've been waiting quite patiently to respond. I think he is quite wrong to use the judgment against Schabir Shaik to imply that President Zuma is therefore automatically guilty. The judge who sentenced Schabir Shaik, Hilary Squires, went out of his way to say that he's been wrongly reported by many in the media to say that there was a mutually corrupt relationship between President Zuma and Schabir Shaik. That eventually led to Mr. Justice Hilary Squires having had to write a formal letter to the media to state that this is not the case, and I think many legal experts will be able to say that the fact that Schabir Shaik had been found guilty does not automatically prove the guilt of President Zuma. Secondly, to say that there's been a long period that expired during which President Zuma used his legal rights, like every citizen in this country is entitled to do, and then to claim that he's therefore trying to avoid his day in court is entirely wrong. All of us, including me, including you, in whichever country you are, will use all the legal avenues available to you to defend yourself. And in South Africa, because of the struggle that we fought for a constitutional democracy, those rights exist. Now let me go to the issue that you've raised with regards to President Ramaphosa. Of course, there are serious concerns about persistent allegations of vote buying at the 54th National Conference of the African National Congress. And those allegations are even strengthened by the fact that President Cyril Ramaphosa and those who supported him went to the courts and insisted that the bank records, which deals with the finances that were used by them during that campaign, finances that some say can tally to over R1 billion, which is quite extraordinary for an inter-political contestation within a political party such as the African National Congress. So it reflects poorly on President Ramaphosa and on those who have been with him that those bank records have not been unsealed. Because obviously they will continue to hang a cloud of suspicion over his head and over his supporters' heads until this is cleared, especially since there are also allegations that there have been legal practitioners and judges who have received money out of those accounts, which casts a serious and dark cloud over judiciary in South Africa. So we have been saying in the African National Congress, and I'm a member of the ANC, President Ramaphosa is also my president, that for the sake of the African National Congress and for the sake of President Ramaphosa's ability to govern and also to be a president that is effective of the African National Congress, he should open those bank accounts. Unfortunately, he has not done so. That leads to some serious questions on why that is happening. And that brings us to the point that I and many other members of the African National Congress have been making, that it is not fair to use the very legitimate, and I want to emphasize this again, the very legitimate fight against corruption in a selective manner in order to target certain people, because you do not agree with them ideologically, within the ruling party, the African National Congress, and let other people off the hook. The case that I mentioned to you with regards to President Ramaphosa and those monies that are now not able to be probed because those bank accounts are sealed, stand in a very sharp contrast to the manner in which President Zuma, in the State Capture Commission and also in this trial, and also the Secretary General of the African National Congress, Comrade Ace Magashule, are being treated. And that sense of unfairness, of unbalanced concentration on certain people within the ANC, and while others are getting free and off the hook, is a very serious concern, which I've raised consistently. And for me, it is a matter of principle that if you fight corruption, you fight it even-handedly, and that Lady Justice should always, in every instance, be blind.
Andrew Feinstein, you agree that there's a double standard?
You know, Carl and I don't agree on a great many things, but there are two things that he said that I absolutely agree with. The first is that Schabir Shaik's conviction doesn't automatically mean Jacob Zuma is guilty, as he pointed out. However, the fact that Shaik was convicted does suggest that there is prima facie evidence of corruption against Jacob Zuma, which is why this case has been brought. The second thing is, I agree entirely with Carl that there should be no selectivity in who faces prosecution and who doesn't. I have spent over 20 years writing about, investigating South Africa's and many other global arms deals, because we must remember that the arms industry accounts for 40% of all corruption in all global trade. And I'll come back to that in a moment. And there are many others in South Africa who received far more money than Jacob Zuma from bidders in South Africa's arms deal. And like Carl, I have spent, it's actually over 20 years now, fighting for all of them to face prosecution. The good news on that front is that since South Africa changed its laws of prescription so that there is no time limit on cases of corruption, it is my understanding that there are investigations that have been resumed into a number of other companies and individuals involved in the South African arms deal. And I agree entirely, justice around corruption is not something that should be meted out on the basis of a factional war within a dominant political party. You are either corrupt or you are not. And it's extremely important that the court process is utilized to determine who is and who is not corrupt. I do think, though, that there is a slight irony that at various points over the last 20 years, Jacob Zuma has complained about the fact that it has taken so long for this court case to take place, while at the same time being behind not all, but a great many of the delays in the court case. And I think in that respect, you can't really have your cake and eat it. The other thing that I think is relevant here is that every South African president since Nelson Mandela left office, so from Thabo Mbeki, has been accused of vote buying within ANC internal elections. And it is a major problem that faces the ANC and faces South Africa's democracy. But here, I would like to make a broader point that I think is extremely important. South Africa is not unique in suffering the consequences of corruption in an arms deal. At the time that BAE Systems, the British company, was paying 115 million pounds of bribes on the South African arms deal, that company, with the help of the then Prime Minister Tony Blair, was paying similar bribes in 7 or 8 other arms deals in 7 or 8 other countries. Thales, the French arms company, has been involved in investigations, allegations, and court cases involving paying bribes to politicians and other decision makers through intermediaries in a whole host of other arms deals around the world.
Okay, and that brings us.
Sorry, one further point on that. It doesn't make South Africa more corrupt. We must remember that where corruption like this takes place, there are those who are doing the corrupting. And an enormous amount of that comes from Paris, London, Berlin, Washington, etc.
Right,
and there are those.
And it just so happens, Andrew, that on Friday, Emmanuel Macron is arriving for a state visit to South Africa. What are you expecting from the French president?
Well, I'm expecting much of the usual stuff of these state visits. They will make all sorts of nice noises, both himself and President Ramaphosa, and they will completely gloss over the fact that a French defense company is standing trial for corruption in a deal that many describe in South Africa's democratic political history as the point at which the ANC lost its moral compass. And if both of them had an iota of integrity and honesty, what they would do is they would stand up and apologize on behalf of their respective governments for their role in, on the one hand, corrupting South Africa and other countries like it, and on the other hand, accepting those bribes. Because unfortunately, this is one of those examples when nobody comes out smelling of roses.
All right, the one place we may hear an apology from Emmanuel Macron will be Rwanda. That's the first stop on this tour of Africa. He wants to show his domestic audience he's making good on his pledge to break with the France-Afrique, that symbiotic relationship between Paris and its former colonies. Macron visiting Rwanda to patch up relations, and he's visiting Anglophone South Africa on this trip, Darius Juncker. Here we can see that the part of the communique that's been put out by the Élysée, the briefing rather, saying that South Africa is a major partner, a G20 member. They're going to talk about things like the environment. They're going to talk about, obviously, the COVID pandemic. Do you think, Darius Juncker, that Thales and the way deals are done will be a factor on this trip?
I doubt it. It will be an elephant in a room, but there will be another much bigger elephant in the room, and that is China. And that's a big motivation for this trip. And President Macron will have done his homework. He will know that Ramaphosa is a Sinophile. He views himself as a Deng Xiaoping type figure in terms of his vision for the reform of the South African economy and to finally break it away from the legacy of colonialism and apartheid and the like. And Macron wants to, like you said, look beyond the Francophonie Africa countries. He's got great ambition. The two have met a handful of times along the sidelines of numerous bilateral meetings, like the one in, multilateral meetings, like the one in Paris last week. But this will be the first state visit. And although state visits are a lot of fluff, as has been said, they are significant because this is the consummation of the political relationship between two countries, between two new leaders, their first state visit. And so Ramaphosa will be having a state visit to France in the near future. And this will be an opportunity for both the multilateral and the bilateral agenda to be pushed. So the multilateral agenda for South Africa is one of more equality. The G77 plus China, for example, is a very important structure for South Africa. For France, it's a member of the permanent Security Council seats. And so there'll be a lot of those kind of agenda items. There'll be more specifically the Islamist insurgency in the north of Mozambique, where Total's $20 billion investment is being threatened. South Africa, being the military power in Southern Africa, is able to play a role there. And that will certainly be high up on the agenda. Bilaterally, investments in power and energy, I think, will also be high up on the agenda. So arms deal, I doubt will receive a lot of time in their meeting.
Or good governance, from what you're saying. Carl Niehaus, let me ask you, just before we go, very briefly, Emmanuel Macron in South Africa, it's just another French president, or is it, as he would like to see it, a new generation that's somehow different?
Well, I'm not hopeful that it's a new generation that is somehow different, because we have seen the institutionalization of exploitation and corruption, especially from the Western countries, and there include Western European countries and also the United States of America. And France has played a central role in that process of exploitation and corruption, especially of Africa. We forget that there is another trial going on at the same time as the one that we have been concentrating on, and that is in France of President Sarkozy, and that exposed quite an expansive amount of action and wrongdoing on the side of France, also within Africa. So I'm not hopeful, because I believe that this is institutionalized, and I think that we haven't seen from the side of countries such as France and Western Europe and the United States of America, which I'd like to call new imperialist powers, any preparedness to stop this kind of undermining and exploitation of the former colonies, which they continue to exploit to the hilt. So no, I'm not hopeful. I do not think much will come out of it. Like Andrew Feinstein, I believe there will be a lot of good-sounding words and very little action, and that is indeed very unfortunate.
Nabila Sheikh, just very briefly, because we're out of time. I looked at the South African papers this morning. It doesn't seem to be much buzz yet about Macron's visit. Too early?
And not as yet. Well, we did see a statement that was issued by the presidency just talking about what the visit would be about, the different topics that are going to be up for discussion there, how South Africa is one of the main trade partners in Africa when it comes to France. And trade is one of the things that we're planning on strengthening as well as part of that visit. So I think there will be a lot more hype when he actually lands in South Africa. And we will have to see what comes out of that visit. As Mr. Nihau said, he's not hopeful. I'm not sure if other South Africans are, but we would definitely have to see what comes out of that visit.
And we'll be covering it. Nabila Sheikh, I want to thank you so much for joining us from Pietermaritzburg. Carl Niehaus in Durban, Andrew Feinstein and Darius Juncker in London. Thank you for being with us here in the France 24 debate.